Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining this second day afternoon panel of this wonderful Watergate at 50 conference that Shane O'Sullivan and Melissa Graves have put together. I'm Garrett Graff. I'm a journalist, a historian, and author of the new book, Watergate, A New History, that published in February. And this session, for the next 90 minutes, we're going to be talking about Watergate myths and counter-narratives. I will present first, and then I'll be joined by James Rosen, the author of The Strongman, the one and only biography, full-length biography of Attorney General John Mitchell, who will be talking about Secret Agenda, Hougan, and Watergate, the final verdict. And then our third panelist this afternoon will be Dr. Joseph Campbell, the author of Getting It Wrong, Debunking the Greatest Myths of American Journalism, who will be talking about Sustained by Selective Memory and Watergate's Dominant Narrative. So I wanted to talk a little bit about one of the main, I think, popular misconceptions that we have of Watergate, which comes from the core line that is in some ways the line that has been handed down from us to Watergate, from Watergate to every subsequent scandal. And it's a line that we hear often in modern scandal, that the lesson from Watergate is that the cover-up is always worse than the crime. And I think what we have now come to understand 50 years later is that that's simply not true. That in fact, Richard Nixon's crimes were many, myriad, and quite terrible abuses of executive power and abuses of the presidential office. At its simplest, Watergate is a story of two separate criminal conspiracies: the Nixon world's dirty tricks that led to the burglary on June 17, 1972, and the subsequent wider cover-up. The first conspiracy was deliberate, a sloppy and shambolic but nonetheless developed plan to subvert the 1972 election. The second was reactive, almost instinctive. It seems to have happened simply because no one said no. It happened because at that point, the Nixon administration was so deep into so many criminal conspiracies that they couldn't actually figure out how to come clean. And understanding that complexity, I think, is key to understanding Watergate as it really exists in its full scope 50 years later. Watergate represented much more than an individual moment, decision, event, or target. It has so many parts that there is no single motive or story to tell. And in fact, we have spent much of the last couple of days hearing those different motives, those different stories, those different motivations of the players who came together in the midst of Watergate. No single thread makes all of the Watergate pieces fit together. Watergate was less an event and more a mindset, a way of life for the Nixon administration, a mindset that permeated the Nixon campaign from 1968 right through his resignation in the summer of 1974, and evolved along the way into a multi-year, multifaceted corruption and erosion of ethics within the office of the president. Watergate, wrote Ted Sulzick, one of the New York Times reporters who covered it, was not born in a vacuum. The men who planned, ordered, and executed the Watergate crimes were neither the product of nor a sudden aberration in American history. Both Watergate and those associated with it were instead the result of a strange historical process with roots in the early years of the Cold War, he wrote. What would be later summarized as dirty tricks, or what America is marking next week with the 50th anniversary of the burglary, the moment that America woke up to the Watergate story, really is the story of how Nixon and his team, ironically blinded by the desire for law and order and national security, systemically violated the constitutional rights of politicians, journalists, and American citizens. Understanding that story as a whole involves not just the bugging operation and burglary of the Democratic campaign offices, but a broader umbrella of what you might call the Watergate mindset. An umbrella that encompasses touring nearly a dozen other specific, related, but separate scandals. From the Chenault affair and the Hougan plan to the Kissinger wiretaps and the illegal bombing of Cambodia, the Pentagon Papers, ITT and the Dita Beard memo, the Vesco donation, milk price fixing, campaign rat fucking, Spiro Agnew's bribery case, the Moore Radford scandal we heard about yesterday, the FBI's co-intel operations, plus a little bit of presidential tax fraud. In fact, Nixon's most famous line in history, "I am not a crook," came not because of the Watergate scandal itself, but because of the associated and concurrent tax investigations. Some of these other scandals would be monumental in their own right. The still opaque Chenault affair, which we have discussed a little bit over the last couple of days, represents one of the only instances of credible treason allegations in U.S. history. And the first ever resignation in disgrace of a vice president by Nixon's number two, Spiro Agnew, came amid a scandal that under normal circumstances would have been more serious than almost any that had touched the White House in the 20th century, yet is still largely forgotten and overlooked today. Each event of these dozen scandals, though, unfolding before, during, and after the bugging operation, influenced the mindset of the Nixon world and shaped the public opinion in Washington's atmosphere as the myriad post-burglary investigations unfolded. Just about the only thing that unites all of these scandals is Richard Nixon himself. Richard Nixon was by almost any measure one of the most consequential political figures of the 20th century. Judged on paper and resume alone, Nixon should stand among the giants who occupied the White House through the American century. As a young congressman, he helped fuel the Red Scare and give life to McCarthyism, turning communist into a career-ending slur. From 1952 to 1972, he was on the Republican Party's national ticket 5 times, a record equaled in that century only by FDR himself. As president, he shaped, escalated, prolonged, and eventually wound down the Vietnam War. He signed the Clean Air Act and created the EPA, signed the OSHA Act, transformed the post office into a quasi-private government enterprise, hiked Social Security payments, took America off the gold standard, declared war on cancer, signed Title IX to give women opportunities in academia and athletic playing fields, transformed the military by ending the draft, and created an all-volunteer force. Along the way, he helped push forward civil rights and tried to position his government at the forefront of equal opportunity, helping to recruit 1,000 women into previously male middle management roles in the government and bringing the first ever female military aides to the White House. He wrestled momentarily with the idea of providing a conservative-style universal basic income to lift Americans from poverty. He averted a larger war in the Middle East amid the Yom Kippur War. He calmed the Cold War, brought détente with the Soviet Union, signed arms control treaties, reopened diplomatic relations with China. He was the first president to visit a communist country, the first to visit Peking, the first to stand in Moscow. In an era when the news weeklies dominated American life, Richard Nixon filled the cover of Time magazine a total of 55 times, more than a year's worth of magazines over the course of his political career, more than any other figure in history. He would, in many ways, be the hinge upon which the entire 20th century turned. The figure who ushered out the expansive liberal consensus of the FDR's New Deal and LBJ's Great Society, and brought to the mainstream a darker, nativist, populist, fear-mongering strain of the Republican Party that would find a half-century later its natural conclusion in the election of Donald Trump. All of those accomplishments, as I list them, though, will be overshadowed by history with the one-word scandal that would ultimately lead to his congressional impeachment hearings and force him ignominiously from office. Nixon was a man who tried throughout his career to achieve greatness, and ultimately, at the end of the day, couldn't get out of his own way. And understanding his mindset and the sense of grievance that animated him is critical to understanding everything that happened before, after Watergate. Nixon's sense of grievance was his central animating feature, his sense of paranoia, his central fixation. The sense that he was an outsider, that the political elites of the world were always laughing at him, the sense that he never got the respect that he deserved. The irony is that even the White House taping system stemmed effectively from his belief and worry that he wouldn't get credit from history for his greatness. And here we have the man who spent nearly 30 years at the top of American power when American power was at its peak. He seems to have experienced one of the loneliest presidencies in memory. He struggled to connect with others. Nixon had only 2 meaningful, deep personal friendships, both men with strange names, both of whom could not have existed further from the high society circles of the Northeast elite. Charles Bebe Rebozo, a Florida laundromat magnate, banker, and real estate speculator, and Robert Abendplatt, the man who made his fortune inventing the mass-produced, cheap, and reliable aerosol valve that transformed consumer goods and enabled everything from spray paint to whipped cream. The first time Rebozo invited Nixon sport fishing, Nixon showed up with a briefcase of work to do on the boat and barely spoke. Abendplatt, meanwhile, provided the president the use of a private 125-acre island in the Bahamas, where Nixon could exist in total solitude. Nixon never learned to spell his top aide John Ehrlichman's name, preferring to instead address notes to him with a simple E. Nixon's chief of staff, Bob Haldeman, his closest professional associate, would remark years later, "To this day, he doesn't know how many children I have." Aides would mock the president behind his back for the awkward way that he would shove White House trinkets, golf balls, pens, cufflinks at Oval Office guests without looking at them. He was uncomfortable greeting people visiting him, the occupant of the most famous office in the world. In fact, throughout his presidency, he went to ever greater lengths in search of solitude. He retreated from the Oval Office to work from a hideaway in the old executive office building, and eventually fled Washington for ever longer stretches to his western getaway in San Clemente or his southern getaway in Key Biscayne, Florida. By his second term, he would retreat to Camp David for weeks on end. His longtime friend and White House aide Bruce Harlow would say years later, Richard Nixon went up the walls of life with his claws. Nixon's comfort was assured through a strict adherence to routine. He ate the same lunch almost every day: a ring of canned pineapple, cottage cheese, crackers, and a glass of milk. The cottage cheese was flown in weekly from his favorite dairy back home, Knudsen's Dairy. He liked bowling alone and walking on the beach alone. He drank too much and couldn't hold his alcohol, especially when exhausted. Even a drink or two could make him loopy, and fought his depression by self-medicating with Dilantin and sleeping pills. And then, beginning in June 1972, Watergate came and consumed him. In the time that I was researching and writing my history of Watergate, the most fascinating moment that I had in my research came as I came to understand just how thoroughly the battle for the tapes devoured Richard Nixon. You see in the Nixon library the presidential daily diaries, those minute-by-minute accounts of how a president spends his day. And what you see is that day after day, week after month, Nixon disappears as the tapes become a bigger and bigger part of his day. Normally, in any normal functioning presidential administration, there is no more important and finite resource than a president's time. Arguably, it is actually America's most fixed and precious commodity. And yet, Nixon's daily schedules get lighter and lighter as Watergate deepens. He retreats for longer periods, and entire afternoons go by with him sitting alone in his executive hideaway, decorated in what you might call politician casual. Its soaring ceilings offset by a favorite lounge chair brought down from the Nixons' New York apartments, sitting before bookshelves packed with presidential biographies, multitudes of miniature elephants, and even a golf cart that celebrates Nixon's single hole-in-one. There he would sit in that lounge chair, writing on his ubiquitous yellow legal pads, drinking a glass of wine or scotch, and waiting while his butler serves dinner. He would sit alone, listening to the tapes, reading, writing, listening to classical music, and stewing. Nixon spent hours listening to them over and over and over again, his final Attorney General William Saxby recalled. He didn't have time for me or any other member of his cabinet, except for Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. It was fascinating to watch and understand month by month just how thoroughly the tapes consume the lonely, grievance-filled Richard Nixon. By Monday, April 22nd of 1973, the official record of his day notes just 2 telephone calls, each 1 minute long. A total of 2 minutes of presidential work in an entire 24-hour day. The next day, between the hours of 9 a.m. and 4 p.m., his schedule records only a single 4-minute call with Kissinger. Friday, Nixon has just 5 telephone calls totaling 12 minutes between 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. It was surely, in its emptiness and solitude, one of the oddest weeks in all of modern presidential history. And to me, it encompasses so well how much this man who tried so hard to be great ends up being shrunk down by Watergate, his own worst enemy, as the mindset of paranoia and conspiracy that he brings to the White House. This sense of grievance, this sense that he has to wake up every day and fight. This sense that every day his enemies are out there sticking it to him, and that he has to wake up and stick it to them first and harder, ends up unraveling Richard Nixon's great presidency. I'm going to welcome now James Rosen to give our second presentation.
All right, can you all hear me all right? I'm going to proceed under the assumption that you can hear me. My thanks to Shane O'Sullivan and Melissa Graves for organizing this stellar constellation of speakers for the symposium and allowing me to be part of it. And also my thanks to Garrett, Graff, and Joe Campbell. My paper today is devoted to a re-examination of the book Secret Agenda, Watergate, Deep Throat, and the CIA by Jim Hougan. The one duty we owe to history, Oscar Wilde once wrote, is to rewrite it. And by that admirable standard, no nonfiction writer of the 20th century fulfilled his duty to history, to the record of our times, more fully, more brilliantly than Jim Hougan. When Secret Agenda, Watergate, Deep Throat, and the CIA was published by Random House in November 1984, more than a decade after the resignation and pardon of Richard Nixon, it presented such a large volume of startlingly revelatory information about a subject so widely considered exhausted that the book was greeted with the staggered astonishment typically reserved for apparitions. If even half of this is true, wrote Pulitzer Prize-winning Watergate historian Anthony Lucas in the New York Times Book Review, Secret Agenda will add an important new dimension to our understanding of Watergate. But Lucas added, "It may be months before reporters can sort through this material, check Mr. Hougan's sources, and decide which of these revelations is solid gold, which dross." Now, 50 years after the arrests at the DNC and 40 years after the appearance of Secret Agenda, the final verdict is in. Not one word in the book was retracted. And while some of Jim Hougan's analytic conclusions have come under challenge, including by this reporter, the wealth of new facts and documentation that Hougan adduced have stood the test of time. Where once it seemed impossible to reckon with the contribution that Secret Agenda made to Watergate, it is now impossible to reckon with Watergate, even after the release of thousands more tapes and documents without reference to Jim Hougan. A case in point, in his opening chapter of Hunt and McCord, the first in-depth examination of E. Howard Hunt and James McCord and their pre-Watergate histories, Hougan advanced the unheard-of notion that the two men had known each other long before Gordon Liddy, the ostensible ringleader of the Watergate operation, introduced them in April 1972. To support this claim, Hougan cited previously unpublished interviews by the FBI and by himself with two credible witnesses. The first was Miriam Ferbershaw, a retired intelligence officer who told federal investigators she had rented a Chevy Chase apartment to the married James McCord and identified Howard Hunt as one of his visitors 2 or 3 years before the Watergate arrests. She also said that McCord had outfitted the apartment, quote, with bugging equipment. Hougan's second source for the Hunt-McCord claim was Enrique Ruiz Williams, a Cuban geologist and Bay of Pigs veteran. In 1963, Ruiz Williams had helped the Kennedy administration resettle and retrain anti-Castro soldiers captured during the abortive invasion of 1961 and who were repatriated to the US. According to Ruiz Williams, Hunt and McCord were both his handlers during the time that he worked as a contract CIA officer with the Second Naval Guerrilla Operation, a Kennedy-era program targeting the Castro regime. Hunt was Ruiz Williams' liaison to CIA headquarters, while McCord performed the same function with respect to other Bay of Pigs veterans. So, did Hunt and McCord know each other before Watergate? Did James McCord work with other Bay of Pigs veterans? In 2002, during my research for my book, The Strongman, John Mitchell and the Secrets of Watergate, published by Doubleday in 2008, I secured from the Library of Congress 5,000 pages of executive session testimony taken by the Senate Watergate Committee. These documents included testimony from Watergate figures who were never summoned for public testimony. Among this group was Felipe Di Diego, the Cuban operative who participated in the Ellsberg break-in and in the first break-in at DNC in May 1972. Space constraints prevented the inclusion of Di Diego's testimony, the unsealed testimony, in the Strongman. The contents of this deposition are revealed here for the first time. Questioned by Senate lawyers R. Philip Hare and Jim Hirschman in June 1973, Di Diego was asked if he had ever met James McCord prior to 1972. "Yes, sir," Di Diego answered. "I did not tell McCord anything about it. And this is the first time I'm going to tell anyone about this," Di Diego told the Senate investigators. "A long time ago, McCord, working for the CIA, did work with a group of Cubans down in Florida. So I saw him at that time. I recognized his face when I first saw him here in Washington. I did not tell him anything about that. It was a long time ago down in Florida, and he had used another name, of course, for the CIA with another group of Cubans down in the Keys." One of the Senate lawyers asked Di Diego, what group of Cubans was McCord working with? "The infiltration group," Di Diego said. "It was a group of Cubans working for the CIA." Still more evidence emerged in CIA documents released in November 2017 in one of the final rounds of declassification mandated under the JFK Records Law. The long-suppressed JFK files, as the news media dubbed them, included several hundred pages from Howard Hunt's CIA personnel file, all previously unreported until now. In July 1969, the records revealed, 9 months before Hunt officially retired from CIA, he was reprimanded by superiors for an open safe violation that occurred earlier that month, his second such offense in less than a year. "I am sure you are aware of the seriousness of this matter," Hunt was told, along with being, quote, warned of possible consequences of future violations. It was CIA's Office of Security, specifically the office's Physical Security Division, that conducted the internal investigation into Hunt's security breach. Hunt, his secretary, and the security officer who discovered the open safe were all interviewed. On July 25, 1969, Hunt's supervisor, one of the highest-ranking CIA officers in Europe, received a stern summary of the episode and a demand to be apprised of any disciplinary action taken from the chief of the Physical Security Division, James McCord. In January 1970, not long thereafter, CIA officials received a tip that 2 years earlier, Howard Hunt, under the pseudonym Edward J. Hamilton, an alias almost identical to one he later employed in Watergate, had circulated without agency clearance a manuscript about his Bay of Pigs experiences. The recipients of the manuscript included William F. Buckley Jr., the godfather of Hunt's children, and two publishers, Arlington House and Wiley & Sons. The matter was seen as a violation of the secrecy oaths that Hunt had periodically been made to sign as a clandestine officer, and was brought to the attention of Director Richard Helms. When confronted, Hunt initially denied any knowledge of such a manuscript. When his interlocutors reminded him of the title, Give Us This Day, the very book Hunt would publish with Arlington House in 1973 under his own name, Hunt's memory improved. Now he insisted the project was only meant as a historical account to be published in 15 or 20 years, circulated to Buckley and the publishers for constructive criticism. Unconvinced, Helms and his senior officers launched another internal investigation that winter. A CIA document, previously unpublished, dated February 17, 1970, stated, Jim McCord to meet the publisher Wiley today, and will find out more details of how Wiley and the manuscript came together, unquote. The JFK files then established that in the 2 years prior to Watergate, James McCord had not only known Howard Hunt, but had investigated him twice. Howard Hunt, investigated twice by James McCord. It's a headline you never heard during Watergate. Last but not least was my 8-hour interview with Alfred Baldwin, the ex-FBI agent hired by James McCord to monitor the wiretaps installed at the DNC. They were not strangers, Baldwin told me in previously unpublished excerpts from our interviews. Hunt and McCord knew each other prior to this whole operation in May and June of '72. You could see the way McCord would look at Hunt, or Hunt would look at McCord, that they knew each other, unquote. My own multiple source confirmation of Jim Hougan's critically important conclusion about an existing relationship between Hunt and McCord, building on the impressive documentation and interviews that the author himself had presented, represents only one area in which the groundbreaking research of Secret Agenda has been shown to be solid gold and not dross. The fact is that virtually all of Jim Hougan's most important work in this book was substantiated by the investigations, official and journalistic, that followed his planting of the obelisk in 1984, to wit. No credible historian now questions that both Hunt and McCord, though each officially had retired from CIA when they joined the Nixon White House and the committee to re-elect the president respectively, maintained direct contact with the agency's senior echelons in ways that called their allegiances and agendas into question. Consequently, the role of the Central Intelligence Agency in Watergate is now widely understood as deeper, more entrenched, controlling, malign than was acknowledged in the consensus of 1974. Likewise, it now stands beyond dispute, as Hougan was first to assert, that the Ellsberg break-in was not a failure, but in fact resulted in the location and photography of the files sought, and as Hougan reported, the diversion of the undeveloped film from the hands of the plumbers to CIA headquarters. It was to CIA that Howard Hunt turned for much of the technical support that he and Gordon Liddy required: electronic gadgetry, aliases, disguises, the preparation of pocket litter and charts. For the break-in at the Los Angeles office of Dr. Louis J. Fielding, it can now be reported Langley provided Hunt with a camera designed to deprive the Nixon White House of the intelligence on it. Quote, the camera was constructed in such a way that it was preloaded by CIA technicians, Hunt disclosed in executive session testimony on June 12, 1973, previously unpublished and obtained through my FOIA research for the strong man. We had no way of entering the camera to take out a cassette of film. The entire object had to be returned to the CIA. We never saw it again, unquote. Subsequent scholarship has similarly affirmed the focus that Secret Agenda placed on the theretofore overlooked role of Eugenio Rolando Martinez. As Hougan was the first to disclose, Martinez, the sinewy Bay of Pigs veteran nicknamed Muscolito, was the one member of the plumbers team actively employed on the CIA payroll at the time of the DNC operation. Among the documentary treasures of Secret Agenda was the rich record of interaction between Martinez and his CIA case officers. Hougan also broke new ground in reporting that during the Watergate arrests, 50 years ago next week, the plainclothes police had wrestled from Martinez's possession at gunpoint after a scuffle a key taped to a small spiral notebook. The FBI swiftly matched this key to one desk, the desk of DNC Secretary Ida Maxey Wells, the true target, along with her boss, R. Spencer Oliver Jr., the executive director of the DNC Association of State Democratic Chairmen, of the lone working wiretap that was monitored by James McCord and Alfred Baldwin across the 3-week lifespan of the DNC surveillance operation. Martinez never disclosed how or from whom he obtained the key to Maxey Wells' desk. As Hougan reported, the FBI also determined that the only 2 known copies of the key belonging to Wells and another DNC secretary, Barbara Kennedy, well, the women were able to produce them when investigating agents asked to see them. The appearance of a key in Martinez's hands thus remains one of several Watergate mysteries for the next generation of scholars to pursue. However, a lengthy CIA document, declassified in August 2017, released in response to litigation filed by Judicial Watch and first reported by this reporter, demonstrated how determined the agency was to conceal Eugenio Martinez's role as a double agent in the Plumbers. A draft working paper entitled CIA Watergate History, 155-page internal review of agency involvement in the scandal prepared by CIA's Office of Inspector General, recounted what happened when lawyers for the Watergate Special Prosecution Force demanded access to Martinez's CIA file. At a tense meeting between CIA's general counsel and 2 lawyers for the Watergate Special Prosecutors, held on October 12, 1973, the agency, according to the Inspector General's report, flatly refused to turn over the materials. John S. Warner, CIA's general counsel at the time, explained, quote, why such a request was difficult for the agency, the breaching of trust of an agent. Warner stated that under no circumstances would the agency give up all records relating to the agency's relationship with Martinez and would resist to the utmost compliance with a subpoena, unquote. The extreme sensitivity of CIA's employment of Martinez was reflected in still another previously unpublished document that I uncovered. In December 1973, Richard Helms, by then serving as U.S. ambassador to Iran, sent his old colleagues at CIA a classified cable from Tehran, relating an anecdote that had occurred 5 days earlier when Helms had visited with Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. The latter related that Alexander Haig, Kissinger's former NSC deputy, by then serving as White House Chief of Staff, had made what Kissinger considered a shocking proposal. Senator Howard Baker, ranking Republican on the Senate Watergate Committee, should be enlisted to charge that the CIA, quote, knew about the Watergate burglary 30 minutes before it occurred, unquote. Kissinger assured Helms that he had poured cold water on the idea, that the Secretary of State had told Haig flatly, quote, to do this would be wildly irresponsible. On December 3, Helms cabled back to Langley to register his own alarm. He wrote it was unclear to him whether Haig, quote, would have been basing his allegation on information from Martinez or just what, unquote. These revelations that CIA officials considered Eugenio Martinez, quote, an agent during his work for the Plumbers, that Langley was prepared to fight to the death to withhold Martinez's files from the hands of the Watergate special prosecutors, and that Dick Helms immediately thought of Eugenio Martinez when the subject turned to possible CIA foreknowledge of the break-in, only substantiated the evidence and conclusions that Secret Agenda had presented back in 1984 about Muscolito, the agency that was his true master in Watergate, and the deeper dimensions of the scandal. Utilizing FOIA from 1978 to 1980, Hougan became the first person outside of the government to review the 30,000 pages that comprise the FBI's investigative file looking into the Watergate break-in and surveillance operation. This still ranks as one of the greatest exclusives in the history of American journalism. This triumph enabled Hougan to reconstruct the DNC break-ins and surveillance with greater detail than any investigative body had done, and to disclose for the first time the official conclusion of the FBI laboratory that the Democrats had likely planted the so-called September bug on Spencer Oliver's phone, a bombshell that Earl Silbert, the Washington Post, and other shapers of what we might call the conventional narrative of Watergate, even after yesterday's proceedings in this symposium, have never satisfactorily explained. Hougan's evidentiary scores also included 2 entire sections of the Senate Watergate Committee Minority Report that had been excised, Maxie Wells's executive session Senate testimony, a number of CIA documents that Hougan said, quote, still remain classified, the shift logs maintained by the General Security Services firm, which employed the security guards at the Watergate, and intelligence reports prepared by Washington, D.C. police. In terms of document production, no other writer on Watergate approaches Hougan's record. Hougan also displayed astonishing range as an interviewer, from John Mitchell and Richard Helms to policemen and prosecutors, from pimps and prostitutes to DNC secretaries and Shadowy Hill staffers, from the born again to the down and out. Among the most remarkable interviews in Secret Agenda was with former Secret Service officer William McMahon, who disclosed that CIA had detailed employees from the Office of Security, James McCord's former employer, to the Secret Service unit that maintained the White House taping system. This revelation carried with it the mind-boggling implication, as Hougan noted, that CIA had enjoyed, quote, unrivaled access to the president's private conversations and thoughts for the 2 years that the White House taping system was operational. This, too, is an area of Watergate research ripe for new exploration. Secret Agenda was a David and Goliath event. The narrative Hougan upended belonged to the quintessential public event, a saturation coverage mythos as deeply embedded in Western imagination as the Civil War or the Beatles. The public, Hougan wrote, has the impression that every aspect of Watergate was thoroughly investigated. In fact, Hougan continued, virtually no investigation was made of the attempted break-ins at the DNC over the Memorial Day weekend. Neither was the June 17 break-in much investigated because, after all, the burglars were caught red-handed. Nixon's enemies wished to make a morality play of the affair. Necessarily, this entailed a simple story with the president at its center. Close scrutiny of the burglars was to be avoided because such scrutiny raised questions about their loyalty to President Nixon. This in turn obscured the issue of presidential guilt, and in doing so threatened Nixon's ouster. In a sense, therefore, the Democrats and the press, Hougan wrote, were as much opponents of a full investigation of the Watergate affair as the White House itself. The scandal was a potential embarrassment to both parties, unquote. This was heretical stuff in 1984. No wonder Bob Woodward privately enlisted Cy Hirsch to contact the editors of Secret Agenda ahead of publication to spread doubt about Hougan's reliability. What Woodward did was totally scurrilous, Hougan told Robert Getlin in a 1985 interview, also previously unpublished. He was trying to sabotage the project before he'd read it. Why? Perhaps because, among the other documents published for the first time in Secret Agenda, was a 1973 CIA memo in which agency asset Robert Bennett, later U.S. Senator from Utah, boasted of how he was supplying Bob Woodward with tips that led away from CIA involvement in the scandal, and how Woodward was, quote, suitably grateful. Reviewing Secret Agenda for the Washington Post Newsday editor, Anthony Marrow wrote, Hougan has attacked the official record of Watergate with persistence and considerable skill. He has added an enormous amount of raw data and information to the record, and his book should lead to a re-examination and reassessment of important parts of the story. That re-examination eventually came in books such as Silent Coup, the New York Times bestseller, and my own, The Strong Man, and in the 10-year Todeskampf of defamation litigation that pitted John and Maureen Dean and Maxie Wells against Gordon Liddy and other defendants. Between the two jury trials that were held in Wells v. Liddy, in both of which I testified, and which ended with victory for defendant Liddy, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that the, quote, evidence arrayed by the defense, quote, tends to corroborate the call girl theory generally, unquote. This marks a rare stamp of approval issued by an appellate court one rung below the Supreme Court on revisionist Watergate scholarship. All this and more is the legacy of Jim Hougan, who brought to the subject of Watergate not only the most extraordinary research effort and bold analytic insights, but a literary style worthy of a best-selling spy novelist, which Hougan later became. Our debt to him and histories is profound and as yet only marginally repaid. A more complete version of this paper will appear on the website Real Clear Politics, Real Clear Investigations on the 17th of June. Thank you very much.
James, thanks so much for a fascinating presentation. Let me ask Dr. Joe Campbell to come out now from backstage and give his presentation. A reminder to those watching that you can ask questions in the Q&A function on your screen anytime, and we will be back after Joe's presentation to take questions and talk for the remainder of our session as a group. Thanks very much. And Joe, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Garrett. And my many thanks to Shane O'Sullivan for inviting me to participate in this really fine 2-day symposium. It's been a real pleasure. And it's also a pleasure to share a platform with you, Garrett, and with James Rosen. You know, one thing is certain about Watergate 50 years on, and that is that Watergate's dominant popular narrative has proven to be impressively durable, resistant to challenge, to debunking, and even to revision. So, what is Watergate's dominant popular narrative? It's pretty straightforward, actually. It posits quite simply that the dogged reporting by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein for the Washington Post, guided by a high-level super secret source codenamed Deep Throat, exposed the crimes and misdeeds of Watergate that brought down Richard Nixon's presidency in August of 1974. It is a simplistic David versus Goliath tale. I call it the heroic journalist myth of Watergate. And like most myths about the news media, the heroic journalist construct is simplistic, straightforward, focused, it's easy to remember, and easy to retell. The heroic journalist myth is at the center of collective memory about Watergate. And it's likely to remain there as the centerpiece for years to come. The heroic journalist myth is not just the dominant popular narrative of Watergate, it is also an inspiration and a source of reassurance for American journalism, a field that has been buffeted by considerable turmoil over the past 25 or so years. As the media scholar Matt Carlson wrote maybe a dozen or so years ago, journalistic retellings of Watergate have been foundational to journalism's self-identity. Or as Michael Schudson, another media scholar, has written, the Watergate myth is sustaining. It survives to a large extent impervious to critique. It offers journalism a charter, an inspiration, a reason for being large enough to justify the constitutional protections that journalism enjoys. So, what's wrong with the heroic journalist interpretation of Watergate? There are at least three major factors. One is that it diminishes and disregards the significant contributions of official investigative bodies, such as federal prosecutors, the FBI, panels of both houses of Congress, and ultimately the Supreme Court. All of these were far more important in uncovering and exposing the crimes of Watergate. The heroic journalist myth also minimizes the fundamental centrality of Nixon's White House tapes in the outcome of Watergate. As one of the leading historians of Watergate, the late Stanley Cutler, once said, without the incriminating content of the White House tapes, Nixon walks. That is, he likely would have served out his second term as president without the White House tapes. Or as Barry Sussman wrote in his book in 1974, had Nixon not been so foolish as to install that taping system in his office, or if Alexander Butterfield had not made the historic revelation of its existence to the Senate Watergate Select Committee, Richard Nixon undoubtedly still would have been president of the United States. Again, Sussman, an unsung journalistic hero of Watergate, wrote this in 1974. Another serious drawback to the heroic journalist myth of Watergate is that it pushes a very simplistic and superficial and misleading interpretation of Watergate, one that even Bob Woodward has disputed. He once said in an interview with a reporter or journalist for the now defunct American Journalism Review, to say that the press brought down Nixon, that's horseshit. And it is striking. It really is striking what other Watergate era principals at the Washington Post have had to say about the heroic journalist construct. 25 years ago, Katharine Graham, who was publisher of the Post during the Watergate period, said publicly at a program at the Old Museum in Roseland, Virginia. She said, "Sometimes people accuse us of bringing down a president, which of course we didn't do and shouldn't have done. The processes that caused Nixon's resignation were constitutional," a reference to the work of the FBI, special prosecutors, panels of both houses of Congress, and ultimately the Supreme Court. Also 25 years ago, Ben Bradley, who was executive editor of the Post during the Watergate period, said on a Sunday talk show, "It must be remembered that Nixon got Nixon. The Post didn't get Nixon." Bradley was referring to the White House audio tapes, which Nixon had secretly made, and which revealed Nixon's guilty role in attempting to obstruct the FBI investigation into the break-in at Democratic National Committee headquarters 50 years ago next week. As fellow panelist Garrett Graff has pointed out, the history we remember is not the history that actually happened. And so it is with the dominant popular narrative of Watergate. To a striking extent, this narrative rests on highly selective collective memory. It has been sustained by an emphasis on highly selective elements of Watergate history and Watergate lore. Imagine, if you will, how different Watergate might seem today, 50 years on, if the focus of popular memory about the scandal were to be shifted in ways both plausible and defensible, to separate fable from fact. In other words, if less heroic aspects of Watergate's heroes were to be emphasized. Now, I argue there's nothing forced or contrived or counterfactual about such a shift in focus. It would be a justifiable revision of Watergate popular history, and it would offer a clearer understanding of the scandal's legacies. There are several ways in which popular memory could be plausibly shifted. Ample material certainly is there. So instead of the simplistic, easy to understand, easy to grasp David versus Goliath dynamic that is central to the heroic journalist myth, what if popular memory were to focus on the ethical lapses and the questionable reporting tactics of Woodward and Bernstein? It is not often remembered that during their Watergate reporting, Woodward and Bernstein approached federal grand jurors. This was in December of 1972, and encouraged them to violate their oaths of secrecy about testimony that they had heard. Woodward and Bernstein acknowledged in their book about their reporting, All the President's Men, that approaching grand jurors was indeed a seedy venture. They claimed that doing so did not produce any useful information. But when he found out what the reporters had done, Chief Federal Judge John Sirica was livid. And according to the Post lawyer, Sirica needed a lot of persuading to keep Woodward and Bernstein from going to jail. Another questionable tactic was Bernstein seeking and obtaining telephone records of private individuals, namely confidential confirmation of telephone calls that Bernard Barker, one of the Watergate burglars, had placed to the Nixon re-election committee in the days in the run-up to the burglary. And even worse was how they essentially ratted out an FBI agent, Angelo Lano, whom we heard from yesterday. Woodward and Bernstein thought that Lano had misled them on a story in late October 1972, a story on which the reporters had aired badly. Woodward and Bernstein had reported then that H.R. Haldeman, Nixon's top aide, had been implicated in grand jury testimony as having control over a slush fund used to finance the burglary. Years later, Woodward and Bernstein acknowledged that they had blundered and erred in taking Lano's names to his higher-ups. And so let's take a quick look at a video clip from a few years ago in which Woodward and Bernstein discuss this moment.
I assume you're referring to the testimony before the grand jury as reported in the Washington Post this morning.
Let me back it up a minute.
CBS News headquarters country said to those in the Washington Post is doing it.
You're not out there on your lonesome anymore.
That's right.
But 2 weeks after their biggest story came their biggest mistake. They incorrectly reported that Hugh Sloan had told a grand jury White House Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman controlled the fund which paid for all that espionage and sabotage.
I assume you're referring to the testimony before the grand jury as reported in the Washington Post this morning?
Correct.
Our answer to that is an unequivocal no. We did not. Mr. Sloan did not implicate Mr. Haldeman in that testimony at all.
This must be the moment when you throw up.
Worse. We thought we might have to quit.
How many sources did you have for that story? We had 2 or 3, and we had some logic. And of course, logic isn't a source, and that's one of the lessons that we learned. And it was painful.
So painful that they ratted out an FBI agent they thought had lied to them about Haldeman. They went to his boss.
It was the worst of journalism. Look, we accused the #1 aide to the President of the United States, and the attribution was wrong. We were desperate young men.
So you blew a source, deliberately blew a source.
Yes.
What's the ethics of that?
Probably not terribly good.
And then there is Deep Throat. Part of your ground rules with him were not just never to even quote him, but never to acknowledge his existence. And you did that in All the President's Men.
Indeed. We felt we had to lay it all out, tell the truth.
Sure, we've done some things wrong in this administration, and the top man always takes the responsibility, and I've never ducked it.
Deep Throat's role in Watergate caused a sensation. Everyone wanted to know who he was.
No, I'm not Deep Throat.
In fact, Mark Felt, the #2 man at the FBI, was Deep Throat. You put Deep Throat in a position where he had to lie repeatedly in public.
That's right.
But isn't that burning your source?
I had to be aggressive with him. We had to tell the complete story.
In the movie All the President's Men, Deep Throat meets with Woodward in the dead of night in an underground garage.
Cover-up had little to do with Watergate. It was mainly to protect the covert operations. It leads everywhere.
Never has reporting looked so thrilling.
Never has reporting looked so thrilling. Woodward and Bernstein also inaccurately attributed to FBI investigators an account they published in the Washington Post earlier in October of 1972, in which they said that at least 50 Nixon operatives had been set loose in the country to disrupt and spy on Democratic campaigns. An internal FBI memorandum disputed Woodward and Bernstein's claim as absolutely false. And the purported 50 Nixon operatives never really were identified in any case. Even so, the reporters, Woodward and Bernstein, claimed that this was their centerpiece story around which all of Watergate revolved. More accurately, perhaps, it was a story that was really a detour from Watergate. In any event, it's pretty clear that the roster of their lapses and transgressions is too little remembered. It is granted almost no place these days in popular collective memory. And what if that popular collective memory also shifted focus to the suspect motivations of Mark Felt, the high-level FBI official who unwittingly emerged from Watergate as the scandal's most famous secret source. Felt leaked information to Woodward and to Sandy Smith of the New York of Time magazine, not because his motives were pure, altruistic, or high-minded, but plausibly because he wanted to be the top guy at the FBI. He wanted to replace the long-serving director, J. Edgar Hoover, who had died in May of 1972. By leaking to the press, Felt sought to discredit and destabilize the outsider who had been appointed acting FBI director, namely L. Patrick Gray. And by doing so, by destabilizing Patrick Gray, Felt figured that he could enhance his own chances of being named to the Bureau's top position. That, anyway, is the interpretation Max Holland put forward in his book, Leak, Why Mark Felt Became Deep Throat, a book that came out about 10 years ago. So instead of the manipulative and scheming FBI insider, we typically remember Felt from his shadowy, chain-smoking depiction in the movie version of All the President's Men, as what the Washington Post once called the nervous elder guiding the relentless reporter. But in reality, as Bernstein himself once noted, Felt's role in all of this can be overstated. When we wrote the book, we didn't think his role would achieve such mythical dimensions. You can see there that Felt/Deep Throat largely confirmed information that we had gotten from other sources. And instead of lionizing Mark Felt, what if the collective memory about Watergate were shifted to emphasize his own law-breaking conduct, to focus on Felt's authorizing illegal searches of homes belonging to acquaintances of the Weather Underground radicals in the early 1970s. These were known as the FBI's black bag jobs. Felt's criminal misdeeds are almost never discussed in relation to his role as a source in Watergate. But these black bag jobs were committed at a time when he was the agency's acting associate director. He authorized warrantless break-ins of homes and apartments of relatives and associates of the fugitives of the radical Weather Underground. He was indicted, Felt was indicted for conspiracy in the black bag jobs that he approved in late 1972 and early 1973, which was roughly the time when he was speaking with Woodward about Watergate. And according to Brian Burrow, author of the book Days of Rage, here's how the FBI black bag jobs were undertaken at residences of relatives and associates of Weather Underground members. He wrote that each agent had a specific duty. One or two would bag and remove the trash. Others would insert tiny microphones into the overhead lights, taking special care to bug the bedroom. Another agent would be assigned to make copies of any address books and personal correspondence. The squad had a special camera built into a briefcase, and two agents were assigned to photograph the apartment. In most cases, the FBI burglars were able to finish their tasks in 30 minutes or less. Mark Felt was convicted of a conspiracy charge in the case of the black bag jobs, as was his co-defendant, Edward S. Miller, who was head for a time of the FBI Intelligence Division. They were ordered to pay fines, and both were pardoned by President Ronald Reagan in 1981. They claimed, Felt and Miller claimed, that the warrantless entries were justified for reasons beyond reasons of national security. In any case, Felt was no heroic, public-minded, public-spirited whistleblower, as he is depicted in the book and movie All the President's Men. He was no noble character. He was a cunning, ruthless, striving G-man, not above breaking the law. And there is ample material there for a shift in focus of the popular memory about Mark Felt, the most famous news source, the most famous media source of Watergate. So the collective popular memory of Watergate would look considerably different and would be more accurate if these less than glamorous, unheroic features about some of the principal actors of Watergate were prioritized and given emphasis. In other words, if the popular dominant narrative would be that Watergate ended a corrupt presidency despite and not because of journalists and their practices and sources. So quickly, why isn't the less glamorous, unheroic counter-narrative of Watergate more commonly recognized or more often prioritized? Why isn't the unheroic counter-narrative more salient in our discussions and memories of Watergate? There are at least three compelling reasons. One is that the counter-narrative is far more complex and intricate than the simplistic David versus Goliath construct of dogged reporters bringing down a corrupt president. Secondly, the unheroic counter-narrative has not and probably never could be the subject of a high-quality cinematic treatment. No matter what one may think of it, the cinematic version of Woodward and Bernstein's All the President's Men was well done and featured star actors at or near the peaks of their respective careers. The heroic journalist interpretation of Watergate is solidly in place, in large measure because of its cinematic treatment. The movie All the President's Men long ago became an enduring artifact of American popular culture. It sealed the heroic journalist myth of Watergate. And thirdly, the counter-narrative would be or is being defeated by time. In other words, the roster of would-be rival heroes to Woodward and Bernstein is not extensive, and those prospective rival heroes have been passing away for quite some time. Watergate Special Prosecutor Leon Jaworski died 40 years ago. Federal Judge John Sirica died 30 years ago. Barry Sussman, an unsung hero, journalistic hero of Watergate, died last week at the age of 87. Alexander Butterfield, who disclosed the White House tapes, is 96. Woodward and Bernstein are comparatively youngsters in their late 70s. So while the 50th anniversary may be an appropriate occasion for a thorough reconsideration of the dominant popular narrative of Watergate, a full-blown revision is quite likely to take hold. The heroic journalist interpretation of Watergate is just too well established and is likely to remain solidly in place for, let's say, the next 25 years or more. It likely will face no serious challenge by any other living individual who could offer a plausible claim to Watergate hero status. Matt Carlson, the media scholar I mentioned earlier, has pointed out that accuracy is not a hallmark of collective memory. And that is an unfortunate legacy of Watergate, one that we will continue to live with. And we will live with it amid the realization that the collective memory can be, and is, and has been, highly selective. Assuredly, the heroic journalist myth will continue to shape and dominate the collective memory of an unprecedented scandal. Thanks very much.
Joe, thanks so much for that fantastic presentation. It is one that rang very true to me in my own work and research on Watergate. And one of the things that I've been saying as I have been out on book tour is that the challenge of the way that we remember Watergate as a story of two journalists versus the president understates and simplifies what is necessary to protect American democracy and the role that so many institutions played, and in fact so many different heroes, from the FBI to the Special Prosecutor's Office to the House to the Senate, and the courts themselves all had to play in order to bring Richard Nixon to justice in the summer of 1974. We've got about 20 minutes left for conversation here, and there are some questions already coming in. Please go ahead and place any questions that you have in the Q&A, and I will direct them to some of our panelists and pick up some questions of my own. James, turning to you for one of the first questions here, a question from Philip. Putting Nixon aside, who got away with it the most in Watergate? And I love this question in part because I think one of the ways that the burglary skews our historical perception of Watergate is that it causes us to forget just how big and broad Watergate truly was. 69 people ultimately indicted, scores of them either found guilty or plead guilty, including, of course, George Steinbrenner, the New York Yankees owner. Watergate got a lot of people, and there were still others who either didn't end up facing indictment, or people who certainly weren't indicted for everything that they could be. So, James, I'd love to hear your take on sort of who you think has most escaped justice in our telling of Watergate.
Garrett, this being an academic symposium, I feel compelled to begin with some definitional throat clearing. Our definition of Watergate seems continually to expand. In your presentation, we learned that Watergate is not a discrete set of crimes, or even an umbrella term given to a larger set of crimes, but a state of mind. And if that were so, there's no telling how many people got away with it, quote unquote. I don't think President Nixon got away with it. I think he paid a very heavy price, in a sense, for the crimes of his administration, despite his receipt of a pardon from his successor for all crimes, as the pardon noted, that President Nixon had committed or may have committed in office. I think that again, when we say that 69 people were prosecuted or convicted, that's not with respect to the Watergate break-in and cover-up, or as we should properly note, the Watergate break-in and surveillance and cover-up. That includes individuals targeted by all 8 of the different task forces of the Watergate Special Prosecution Force, Mr. Steinbrenner among them for illegal campaign contributions. I am obligated to point out that my book, The Strong Man, John Mitchell and the Secrets of Watergate, published by Doubleday in 2008, endorsed the denials by Attorney General Mitchell that he had ever ordered the Watergate break-in and surveillance operation. The evidence suggests conclusively that he did not, as he maintained to his dying day. The evidence suggests rather that the likeliest culprit for having ordered the break-in was John Dean. And if anyone got away easy in Watergate, it was John Dean, who has in more recent years tried to claim that he never served in prison. He had a 4-month sentence, and it is true that he spent most of those 4 months reclining in cushy chairs in the offices of the Watergate Special Prosecution Force and at Fort Holabird, working on his testimony and his memoir. I think that John Dean was a much more central player in the origins of the Watergate break-in and surveillance operation, in its execution, and of course in the cover-up, in which he acknowledged that he was the, how did he put it, the chief desk officer. His involvement in that cover-up was not, as he tried to maintain, a simple function of blind ambition, the title of his memoir and the rather interesting made-for-TV miniseries from 1979 based on it. In his depositions in the Dean versus St. Martin's lawsuit and in the Wells v. Liddy litigation in 1995, John Dean disavowed that memoir and suggested that it was simply a good commercial version of his story. In any case, I would direct those who asked the question that you posed to me, as probably any shameless author would, to my book, The Strong Man, John Mitchell and the Secrets of Watergate.
Great. So next up, there's a question that I would actually be curious to talk to both of you about, and I certainly have my own thoughts. So, Joe, I'm going to switch and let you lead off and then go to James second, which is Patrick asks, if Deep Throat was a composite figure, as I believe it was, then Felt, because of his later crimes and self-serving desires, seems a questionable figure to finger as the sole source. And I think I would ask you both, do you believe that Mark Felt was Deep Throat as we popularly believe it, or do you believe that Deep Throat was more of a composite source figure in the telling of Woodward and Bernstein?
Garrett, I think it's pretty clear that he was not a composite figure, that Woodward disclosed, or I guess Felt self-disclosed through his family lawyer, several years ago in an article in Vanity Fair that he was deep throat, and Woodward and the Washington Post almost immediately endorsed that. So plus his name had been circulating almost from the start, almost from the time Woodward and Bernstein's book, All the President's Men, was published in 1974. There was this ongoing guessing game, this parlor game in Washington as to who the identity of Deep Throat really was. And he was one of the leading suspects from the start. The Washingtonian had his name out there in 74. So did the Wall Street Journal. And others were identifying Felt as the most likely candidate. He consistently denied that he was, and that denial sort of stuck for about 30 years. And as the years went by, and the identity of Deep Throat was never confirmed, it was never made clear, the notion that it had to have been a composite figure took hold. And it was a very compelling argument that Woodward and Bernstein sort of were dabbling in the new journalism of the 1970s and sort of drew on a number of different sources for this literary device, for this literary figure whom they dubbed Deep Throat. It's a tempting argument. It really is. And for a time, I was inclined to believe that. But I think with the disclosure in 2005, I believe that the self-disclosure by Mark Felt and then the subsequent confirmation by the Post, it's a pretty strong argument that he was not a composite figure. And but there is a little bit of wiggle room in that too, because at the time of that self-disclosure, Felt was suffering dementia and was really unable to discuss his role in Watergate or at the FBI or any other substantive matter in any kind of detail. And so it's there was a little bit of wiggle room, but I'd say it's 95% certain that he was Deep Throat.
James, do you agree?
No, we arrive here at the nirvana, the desired end state of all academic symposia, which is raging controversy and dispute between the panelists. This is no longer subject to argument, as my esteemed colleague suggests. The best book on this subject is called In Nixon's Web. It too was published about 10 years ago or so. It was the unfinished memoir of L. Patrick Gray, who succeeded J. Edgar Hoover as acting director of the FBI at the precise moment, really, when the Watergate arrests occurred. And this was published posthumously with the assistance of Director Gray's son, Ed Gray, himself an established journalist, I believe a fellow resident of Vermont, Garrett. And In Nixon's Web benefits from the files that L. Patrick Gray took with him when he left office. And those are 45 boxes of official FBI evidence relating to Watergate. In fact, it's believed to be the largest collection of Watergate documents that still remains in private hands. But if you read Ed Gray's book that he finished on behalf of his father, Ed Gray went to the University of Texas and combed through the Woodward and Bernstein papers that the university paid, I believe, $2.5 million for? And
close to $5 million,
I think it was $5 million. And in the section of the papers, of Woodward's papers, that are actually labeled Deep Throat, Ed Gray found the notes and transcript of an interview done with someone other than Mark Felt, Donald Santarelli, who was a Department of Justice official in the Nixon administration, who confirmed to Ed Gray that he had been a source for Bob Woodward. And that's not all, because if you review the literature of All the President's Men and the entire canon of Woodward Bernsteiniana, there's a very big problem with the descriptions of the interactions with Deep Throat. First of all, a lot of the information attributed to Deep Throat was not only wrong, but wildly wrong. The stuff of science fiction. There was one important fact that Woodward and Bernstein reported on the basis attributed to Deep Throat that was correct. And it was that there was an 18.5-minute gap on the Watergate tapes. That was a very closely held secret in November 1973 when it was discovered and reported. Only the president, his secretary, Rose Woods, who accepted responsibility for the creation of the 18.5 minute gap, probably wrongly, and some other White House counsel. And as a matter of fact, Mark Felt had left the FBI 5 months earlier. He would not have been in a position to have that information. When anyone brings this up to Bob Woodward, he dismisses it as wiring diagram issues. But it's significant. And there's no question anymore but that Deep Throat was a composite figure. Not all the information attributed to Deep Throat could have come from Mark Felt. It's that simple. And in fact, Bob Woodward's own files at the University of Texas show that in his Deep Throat file, he kept interviews from individuals who were not Mark Felt.
So Garrett, where do you come down on this? And before answering that question, I would like to say dispute the fact that Ed Gray's finished autobiography of his father is the best source on Mark Felt. Actually, it's Max Holland's book, Leak, far superior and far more detailed. But Garrett, I'm very curious.
Let me just add, in response, I reviewed Max Holland's book at his request, telling me just let the chips fall where they may. And I noted these problems in Holland's treatment of the book, that he really went too easy on Woodward, and privately he agreed with me. I think Leak is an excellent book, don't get me wrong, but it didn't take full account of the revelations of Pat Gray's files and of the revelations of the University of Texas papers.
Yeah. And I will actually precisely split the difference between the two panelists here, providing exactly the consensus that that bridges the two of you, which is I have come to settle and believe that sort of both are true, that Bob Woodward, that there is a source that Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein that believe in their heart of hearts is Deep Throat, and that person is Mark Felt. And yet simultaneously, James, I think, is absolutely right that there is information that either willfully or sloppily they attribute to Deep Throat in their book, All the President's Men, that could not have possibly come from Deep Throat himself. And that I think one of the challenges wrapped up in some of this, actually Max Holland sort of dives into in his book Leak, which is there's also sort of a second layer of this where there were most likely a whole team of senior agents loyal to Mark Felt who were sort of sharing leaks that sort of emanated from Mark Felt, even if they were not coming from Mark Felt personally to reporters. So I think I can actually find space to agree with both of you in this situation.
There's an alternative. Let me just briefly mention there's an alternative theory too that Barry Sussman, who died early this month, advanced in his writing for Neiman.org, saying that Deep Throat probably didn't know he was Deep Throat, and he was nice to have around, but he really wasn't that crucial to the Washington Post reporting in 72 and 73 as the scandal unfolded. So there is that interpretation as well, that Deep Throat was sort of a name that was put upon him for the book and All the President's Men, but really wasn't all that valuable or useful to the Post.
And there I'll agree with Joe, simply because the Washington Post itself was not decisive in the fall of Nixon. And therefore, their super duper secret source, Deep Throat, was not decisive. We know this from John Dean, who has stated publicly that the Washington Post's reporting made no difference in the outcome of Watergate, that it was really the FBI investigation and something we haven't mentioned, the litigation filed by the Democratic National Committee, a civil lawsuit against the committee to re-elect the president, which was taking depositions and unearthing evidence. And we also have this from none other than Bob Woodward, who told CBS News in January 1973 that he feared that the period of evidentiary disclosure in Watergate had come to an end. The reporter and the newspaper that really broke the story open was Cy Hirsch and the New York Times, They reported in January 1973 that hush money was being paid to the burglars and their attorneys and family members. And that really broke the story open, as did the letter to Judge Sirica from James McCord. We have to remember that the Watergate cover-up lasted about 9 months. And it probably would have succeeded if Nixon and his men weren't so inept at the execution of a very basic task, which was on the Watergate tapes summarized by the president himself and John Dean as requiring $2 million to keep a certain number of burglars and their lawyers and family members quiet. And one imagines subsequent White Houses saying, $2 million, untraceable cash? What bills do you need? What denominations? What street corner? I'll have it for you in 20 minutes. And Nixon and his men, puzzled with this task of rounding up untraceable cash. You can hear their state of despair in the Nixon tapes where Haldeman says, we don't know how to do things like this. The mafia knows how to do things like this. Maybe you run it through a casino and wash it that way. They were inept at this. And perhaps for that reason alone, Nixon's impeachment and removal from office was warranted in a time of Cold War struggles in a nuclear age around the globe. Not to be able to execute such a simple task as finding $2 million in untraceable cash. It's in a level of ineptitude unworthy of the presidency.
You know, I'll agree with you on two things there, James. One is that Woodward and Bernstein did not disclose the cover-up in Watergate. They said in 73 that it was too high, it was beyond their reach. That's one thing. And then they did not disclose the existence of the White House tapes, which really were pivotal to the outcome of the Senate's investigation, as well as the special prosecutor's investigation of Richard Nixon and Watergate.
Yeah.
But also, Bob Woodward had a key role in the disclosure of the tapes. The tapes were just the existence of the taping system was disclosed in private testimony by Alexander Butterfield to somebody, Scott Armstrong, an investigator for the Senate committee, who was hired by that committee on the recommendation of Bob Woodward, and who was later Bob Woodward's co-author in the book, The Brethren. That's a whole set of events that, again, should lead to a very serious reexamination of Woodward's role.
Yeah. And I would go sort of one step further, Joe, there and say, and as you know, I wrote a piece about this in New York Magazine earlier this winter when my book originally first came out, that Woodward and Bernstein, I think most accurately should be seen as part of a constellation of a half dozen journalists who kept the story alive and moving forward from June of 72 through March of 73. But that arguably that they are not actually responsible for any of the three biggest stories and revelations that unfolded during that time. And that sort of the first blockbuster Watergate story was Walter Ruggerberg's reporting of the Nixon campaign financing of the burglars in Miami-Dade County. That the sort of second blockbuster was Jack Nelson and Ron Ostro's first-person story recounting the exploits of Al Baldwin that James has mentioned that grew out of that Larry O'Brien DNC civil lawsuit that that LA Times piece running in the fall in October 1972. And then, of course, as mentioned here, the Seymour Hersh hush money story that begins in January 1973. And so I think sort of any accurate recounting of journalism's role in keeping that story alive until it gains the momentum of the cover-up falling apart, the hush money coming to the fore, and then James McCord's letter to Judge Sirica in March of 73 puts, I think, sort of gives pride of place to all six of those reporters alongside.
Yeah, and that's a very valuable contribution to our understanding of the media in Watergate. And it's accurate that the Washington Post was not alone in the summer of 1972, in the fall of 1972, was not alone on Watergate. Yet that's part of the dominant narrative, that the Post was heroically out there by itself in reporting on these developments. But you're right, you're quite right. There were 5 or 6 major developments that were not attributable at all to the Washington Post reporting.
So we are right at 3:15 now, the end of our session here. There are a number of great questions still to go, and I'm sure we could have kept this conversation going for much longer. But thank you all for joining us, and I'll invite Shane out to give any closing remarks that he'd like to give for our session today.
Thanks very much, Garrett and James and Joe. Thanks very much for such an entertaining panel, fascinating presentations, and yeah, the element of drama in the dialectic between Joe and Joseph later on, skillfully moderated by Garrett and very good humored and full of ideas, which is just what we want to capture in the conference. So yeah, thanks very much for your participation. The recording of this will be available shortly on the conference website and also on the YouTube page. And thanks again for being here, both to the audience and to yourselves. And we hope you'll join us for our final session in 30 minutes, or sorry, in 15 minutes at 3:30 p.m. With David Kaiser and Tom Cryer and myself. And yeah, thanks a lot. It was really, really enjoyable. And thanks for your insights, particularly into the deep throat issue, which will never be adequately resolved. But we'll have.
But it is.
It has been. It was resolved at this very panel.
We could be here for another hour. Anyway, thanks again. We'll end it there.